The firelight of Clancy's tavern flickered, casting a warm glow on the mismatched faces of the familiar dungeon raiders. Triton and his companions sat at their usual table near the hearth, waiting for the arrival of their latest client. A pitcher of ale rested in front of them, mostly drained with Grodd already reaching for a refill. Ven lounged at the next table, fingers deftly shuffling a worn deck of cards, his sharp gaze scanning the room, waiting for some foolhardy patron to surrender to temptation and risk their coin on the fickle turn of fate.
Any idea who we are expecting?
Lana asked, leaning back and absent-mindedly twirling a dagger in her hand. Mesra glanced toward the door, her sharp elven eyes scanning every newcomer.
Not a clue, but they said they'd be here by sundown. It's already past that.
Probably some stuck-up noble who can't be bothered to tell time.
Grodd grumbled.
As long as the pay's good, I won't complain. Much.
Ven let out a low, amused chuckle as he dealt a hand of cards to a group of overeager patrons, their eyes gleaming with misplaced confidence. A sly grin curled on his lips.
Grodd, you'll grumble no matter what. It's the one thing you've truly mastered.
Before Grodd could retort, the tavern door creaked open, and a slender figure of a woman, wrapped in a heavy blue cloak, stepped inside. The face was obscured by the hood, but the room seemed to quiet slightly at her arrival. The figure moved with purpose toward Triton's table, the soft jingle of a satchel at her side hinting at wealth or importance.
Finally, you must be the one who sent the letter,
Triton said, standing to greet her. The figure pulled back her hood to reveal a middle-aged woman with black hair and piercing blue eyes. She held herself with an air of quiet authority, her gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Triton.
I am Alira Vesrin of the Kingdom of Arudia,
she said, her voice smooth and measured.
And yes, I'm the one who requested your presence. I trust you all have been briefed?
Not exactly. All we know is that you're looking for something rare.
Mesra replied, her tone cautious. Alira nodded, pulling a rolled parchment from her satchel and placing it on the table.
The Sapphire Crown, an artifact of immense Arudian historical value, lost for centuries. It is said to lie in the ruins of Velithar, deep within the Whispering Caverns.
The Whispering Caverns? I've heard of them. Dangerous place, full of shadows and other things,
Grodd said, frowning.
Other things? That's descriptive.
Lana quipped.
Things that bite,
Grodd said flatly, taking a long swig of ale. Alira ignored the banter and continued.
The crown is not only priceless, but has significant personal importance to my family. I'm willing to compensate you generously for its safe return.
Triton exchanged glances with his companions before returning his gaze to Alira.
We'll need more details. Traps, guardians, rival interests.
Alira hesitated.
The caverns are rumored to have traps, and I've received reports of strange creatures lurking within. No rival interest that I'm aware of.
Ven leaned forward after dealing his hand with the other players.
Sounds like a grand adventure. I'm in.
The others nodded in agreement. Alira turns to Triton, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she presses a heavy sack of coins into his hand.
Consider this a token of faith, 20% down payment. The rest of your reward awaits, but only when the Sapphire Crown is safely in my possession. Seek me at the inn upon your return, third room on the left. Don't keep me waiting long.
Triton gives a firm nod, his fingers tightening around the sack of coins before slipping it away with practiced ease. His eyes meet Alira's, steady and resolute.
Understood, and thank you.
With a curt nod and a swift turn, her cloak flares behind her as she disappears into the tavern's shadows, leaving only the faint echo of his words hanging in the air. Tressa, one of the barmaids, waves over at Triton from the bar. He nods, then walks over to her, who has a sealed scroll in hand.
This just came in for you, hun.
Tressa said, her tone unusually subdued. She handed over the scroll, the wax seal gleaming faintly in the dim tavern light. It bore no identifying mark, but something about it felt ominous.
The messenger left a moment ago.
Tressa added, stepping away to quickly assist another patron at the end of the counter. Triton accepted the scroll without a word and took a seat at the corner of the bar, away from prying eyes. The faint crackle of the seal breaking felt louder than it should have been. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the parchment. His sharp gaze moved quickly across the words, the faint flicker of the tavern's candles casting shadows over his face. As he read, his expression shifted, first confusion, then dread, followed by an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. His breath hitched as the full weight of the message hit him. Triton shut his eyes tightly, as though closing them could block out the sudden, invisible blow that pierced his heart. His lips parted, a barely audible gasp escaping as his chest tightened. A single tear betrayed him, rolling silently down his cheek before he quickly wiped it away. For a brief moment he froze, his hand clutching the edge of the parchment so tightly that it crumpled slightly. He stared at the bar counter, his mind racing and his body stiff as if he were holding himself together by sheer will. Slowly, he took a deep breath and exhaled shakily, forcing his emotions back into the fortress he had carefully built over the years. He folded the scroll with a precision born of discipline and tucked it into one of his leather pouches, his movements deliberate and measured. Tressa cast a quick glance from across the bar, her brow furrowed, but she said nothing. Triton sat there for a moment longer, his hands resting on the counter, his gaze fixed on the grain of the wood, as if it held the answers to questions he couldn't yet ask. When he finally rose, his face was a mask of composure, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing beneath the surface. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting his sword belt, and turned toward the table where his companions sat. His footsteps were steady, but there was an unnatural rigidity to his movements, as though every step was an act of defiance against the sorrow clawing at his chest. As Triton approached, Mesra, who had been quietly studying him from afar, tilted her head, her sharp gaze noticing the subtle signs of distress he tried to hide. The rest of the group exchanged quick glances, sensing something was off, but no one dared to ask. Triton spoke briefly. His voice was steady, but distant.
"We'll talk details of our strategy for our quest tomorrow when we head out,"
he said, brushing off any concern.
"For now, enjoy the evening."
He leaned back in his chair, but his usual commanding presence seemed hollow, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. While his companions hesitated, sensing his need for space, Triton stared at the flickering tavern lights, his jaw tightening again. Whatever news that scroll held, it wasn't just a blow, it was a wound, one he would guard fiercely until he was ready to confront it. The next morning, Triton and his companions set out at first light, the weight of their quest pressing heavily on their shoulders. The road stretched long and winding before them, cutting through dense thickets of twisted trees and uneven, rocky terrain. The sun climbed high into the sky, its light barely piercing the thick canopy above. The hours dragged on, the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravel path, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures, their only companions. Before them loomed the Whispering Caverns, a dark and foreboding scar in the earth. The entrance, jagged and uneven, yawned open like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. Tendrils of mist curled and writhed at their feet, spilling out from the cavern as if the darkness within was bleeding into the world outside. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from the depths, a haunting rhythm that seemed to grow louder the closer they stepped toward the threshold. A chill breeze rolled out from the cavern's mouth, carrying with it a faint, eerie whisper that seemed to flit between them, darting around their ears like unseen phantoms. The sound wasn't a voice, but a collection of overlapping murmurs, unintelligible, yet filled with a sinister cadence that set their nerves on edge. Lana instinctively reached for her dagger, her fingers tightening around its hilt, while Ven muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the shadowed entrance.
Let's move and stay close. No one wanders off. These caverns are a maze, and we can't afford to lose anyone.
Triton said, his voice steady but tense. He drew his sword, its steel catching the faint light of Mesra's orb. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the caverns. The ground beneath their boots was slick with moisture, and the walls glistened with veins of strange, iridescent minerals that seemed to pulse faintly with light.
What do you suppose causes that?
Ven asked, gesturing to the glowing veins.
Residual magic, perhaps. Or something worse.
Mesra said, her tone thoughtful.
Comforting.
Grodd muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Lana stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to silence the group.
Wait, do you hear that?
They all paused, straining to listen. The whispers that had greeted them at the entrance had grown louder, now resembling fragmented voices, speaking in a language none of them could understand. It was unsettling, like the sound of 100 faint murmurs overlapping, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once.
It's just the wind. Keep moving.
Triton said, though even he didn't sound convinced. They had only gone a little further when Lana's keen eyes caught something unusual. She knelt down and ran her fingers lightly over the uneven stone floor.
Pressure plates.
Mesra knelt beside Lana, her glowing orb floating above her shoulder.
These seem connected to the walls. Likely a spike trap.
I'll disarm it.
Lana said confidently, pulling a set of tools from her pouch.
Be quick. We're too exposed here.
Triton said, his eyes scanning the cavern ahead. The group watched tensely as Lana worked, her hands steady and precise. After a few agonizing moments, there was a soft click, and the pressure plate locked in place.
Done. Let's move before something decides to jump out at us.
She said, standing up and dusting off her hands. The path ahead grew narrower and darker, forcing the party to tread carefully. Mesra's glowing orb hovered above her hand, casting faint, trembling light over the jagged walls. The air grew colder, heavier, and carried with it the unmistakable stench of decay.
Something feels off.
Lana whispered, her voice barely audible as she scanned the darkness ahead. She crouched low, her daggers ready in her hands.
Off. This whole damned place is off.
Grodd grunted, his tone gruff.
Quiet!
Triton said sharply, holding up a hand to signal the group to stop.
Do you hear that?
They all froze, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the faint dripping of water from the cavern ceiling. Then it came, faint yapping noises, almost like a pack of dogs. It echoed unnervingly, seeming to come from all directions.
Sounds like hellhounds looking for their next meal. Us.
Ven muttered, gripping the handle of his whip.
Those don't sound like hellhounds.
Mesra said. Her eyes darted around the cavern as she whispered an incantation under her breath. The light from her orb grew brighter, illuminating the rocky walls, and revealing dozens of faint, glimmering crimson eyes peering back at them from the shadows. Suddenly, from hidden crevices and shadowy alcoves, 10 snarling kobolds surged forth, their beady eyes gleaming with malice and crude weapons raised high. Their hissing battle cries echoed through the cavern, a cacophony of rage and desperation. Triton's instincts flared. With a roar that matched the ferocity of the ambush, he lunged forward, his blade arcing like a flash of silver lightning. His first strike cleaved clean through a kobold's chest, sending it sprawling to the blood-soaked stone. Without missing a beat, he pivoted, driving his sword deep into the gut of another. Its shriek cut short as it collapsed at his feet. Mesra stood her ground, her eyes blazing with arcane fury. She whispered an incantation, her hands weaving patterns of searing light. A bolt of crackling energy burst from her fingertips, striking a kobold square in the chest. The creature's body convulsed violently before it crumpled into a smoking heap. She turned with deadly grace, unleashing a second blast that pierced through another kobold's skull. Its lifeless form slamming against the cavern wall. Ven cracked his whip with precision born of countless battles. The leather coil snapped through the air with a sharp crack, wrapping around the neck of a charging kobold. With a savage tug, he yanked the creature off its feet, its spine snapping with a sickening pop. Pivoting smoothly, he lashed out again, the whip's tip slicing across another kobold's throat, a crimson spray marking his deadly accuracy. Lana moved like a shadow, her daggers flashing in the dim light. She slipped between the chaos, her blades finding the vulnerable gaps in kobold defenses. She drove one dagger deep into a kobold's back, the blade piercing its heart. Spinning gracefully, she slashed another across the face, the razor-sharp edge opening a fatal wound that left the creature gurgling its last breath. Grodd roared with unrestrained fury, his massive great axe a whirlwind of steel and death. He brought the weapon down with brutal force, splitting a kobold from shoulder to hip in a spray of gore. His next swing crushed another's skull like brittle pottery, the cavern walls painted with the remnants of his savage onslaught. One by one, the kobolds fell beneath the relentless assault. Blood pooled around their broken bodies, mingling with the dirt and dust of the ancient cave. As the echoes of battle faded, Triton and his companions stood amidst the carnage, their breaths ragged but victorious. The cave grew silent once more, save for the distant drip of water and the faint metallic scent of blood lingering in the cold, damp air.
Everyone all right?
Triton asked, his voice steady but weary.
Still in one piece.
Ven said, though he winced as he rubbed a fresh scratch on his arm.
I've had worse.
Grodd said, though he was limping slightly.
Barely a scratch.
Lana said, with a faint smirk, wiping her daggers clean on a piece of cloth. Mesra leaned heavily on her staff, her face pale from the exertion of her spells.
That was more than I expected.
Why do I get the feeling that was just the warm-up?
Ven said, glancing nervously at the dark tunnel ahead.
Because it probably was. Let's keep moving. We've still got a long way to go.
Triton said grimly, wiping his blade clean. With renewed caution, the group pressed onward, their nerves on edge and their weapons at the ready. The Whispering Caverns had proven themselves deadly, and none of them doubted that greater challenges still lay ahead. The group stood before an enormous, yawning chamber, the ceiling arching high above them like the ribcage of a long-dead beast. Stalagmites and stalactites framed the room like jagged teeth, and a faint blue glow emanated from the far end of the cavern. The source of the light was unmistakable. A pedestal carved from polished obsidian stood atop a raised platform, and resting upon it was the Sapphire Crown. The artifact was mesmerizing. Its delicate, crystalline structure seemed to shimmer with an inner light, casting intricate reflections across the cavern walls. The crown was both elegant and ancient, its craftsmanship so flawless that it seemed otherworldly.
There it is, the Sapphire Crown,
Mesra whispered, her voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Grodd grunted, hefting his great axe.
About time. Let's grab it and get out of this cursed place.
Not so fast. Look at the floor.
Lana interjected, her sharp eyes scanning the chamber. The ground leading to the pedestal was covered in a mosaic of carved tiles, each marked with intricate symbols and patterns. Some tiles were cracked, others discolored, and the faint outline of skeletal remains lay scattered across the chamber.
Traps. Lana, can you make sense of this?
Triton said grimly, stepping forward cautiously. Lana crouched low, her fingers tracing the symbols on the nearest tile.
It's a pattern. Step on the wrong one and, well, you can guess what happens.
How lovely.
Ven muttered, leaning against a stalagmite. Lana began to move forward, her steps deliberate and precise. She paused often, her eyes darting between the tiles and the distant pedestal. The others stayed behind, watching with bated breath as she navigated the deadly mosaic.
What do you see?
Triton called out, his voice low but steady.
The symbols. They follow a sequence.
Lana replied, not taking her eyes off the tiles.
Circles, stars, then crescents. Step on anything else and
A faint click echoed through the chamber as her foot hovered over a mismatched tile. She froze, her breath hitching.
that happens.
The ground rumbled, and a burst of arrows shot out from hidden slits in the walls, narrowly missing Lana as she dove to the side.
Lana!
Mesra cried out, but the rogue held up a hand as she picked herself up, unscathed.
I'm fine, but I think we just confirmed the trap.
She said, brushing herself off. After what felt like an eternity, Lana reached the pedestal. She examined it carefully, her daggers poised as she searched for additional traps.
It's clean. No pressure plates, no other gadgets, just the crown.
That's too easy. It's never just the crown.
Mesra said, stepping forward. The cavern's air was thick and oppressive, the faint blue glow of the sapphire crown drawing the group's eyes like moths to a flame. Its light bathed the chamber in a surreal, almost dreamlike aura, but none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. Triton's instincts screamed at him as he tightened his grip on his sword, his gaze scanning the chamber.
Something's wrong,
He said quietly. Lana crouched low, her sharp eyes searching for traps.
No traps on the floor, but I feel it too.
Mesra's face paled as she reached out to sense the magic around them.
Magic. Old magic. Dark magic.
She murmured, her voice barely audible.
Then we're not alone.
Ven said, as he stood just behind Mesra.
Whatever it is, it will make itself present like anything else. Let's grab the crown and get out of here.
But as they took another step forward, a chilling, disembodied voice echoed through the chamber.
Foolish mortals, you dare disturb my sanctum.
The glow from the crown intensified, and the air itself seemed to ripple. From the shadows emerged a floating figure, its skull hovering above the ground, wreathed in faintly glowing energy. 2 pinpricks of malevolent green light burned in its eye sockets. Ancient runes etched into the bone shimmered faintly, their power humming with dread. Mesra's breath caught in her throat.
By the gods, it's a demilich. A remnant of a once powerful lich. It's more dangerous than it looks.
The demilich let out a hollow, bone-chilling laugh, its voice resonating through the chamber.
You trespassed upon my domain. Those who seek my treasure shall not leave alive.
The air grew colder as a wave of necrotic energy emanated from the skull, sapping their strength. Triton staggered, but managed to stay upright, his jaw clenched.
We've got no choice. We fight.
The hollow eyes of the demilich flared as it began to hover higher, its form radiating dark energy. Suddenly, it unleashed a howl, a sound so chilling and otherworldly that it seemed to pierce their very souls. Ven dropped to his knees, clutching his ears.
What in the 9 hells?
Mesra shouted a word of power, her magic forming a protective barrier around the group.
Stay strong,
She cried, though the effort left her visibly drained. The demilich wasted no time, summoning a cloud of dust that swirled around the chamber, obscuring their vision. Through the haze, its voice echoed mockingly.
You are nothing but fleeting sparks, soon to be extinguished.
Triton charged forward, his sword gleaming as he swung at the hovering skull. The blade struck true, but the demilich's hardened bone deflected the blow. The creature turned its fiery gaze toward him.
Foolish warrior, you dare strike me!
It hissed. A blast of energy drain lashed out, striking Triton and forcing him back. His knees buckled, his face pale, but his resolve held firm as he rose again in a weakened state. Mesra's hands moved in intricate patterns as she conjured a wall of light, the radiant energy pushing back against the demilich's encroaching darkness.
we have to weaken it. Its soul is anchored to this place.
Then let's find the anchor and break it.
Lana called out as she darted through the dust cloud toward the pedestal. Her keen eyes scanned the area, dodging its movements towards her. Ven cracked his whip, the leather snapping around near the demilich.
Come on, you numbskull. Show me what you've got.
The demilich turned toward him, its mouth opening as it unleashed a life drain. Ven stumbled, his energy fading fast, but Grodd stepped in, hurling his great axe with a roar. The weapon struck the demilich, knocking it off balance.
Back to the grave with your skull head!
Grodd bellowed, retrieving his weapon and standing protectively in front of Ven. Meanwhile, Lana reached the pedestal and spotted a faint glimmer beneath the crown, a small, jar-shaped object, pulsing faintly.
I think I found its anchor.
She shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. The demilich screeched in fury.
No! Do not touch that!
It commanded, sending spectral hands flying toward her. Mesra intercepted them with a blast of arcane energy.
Hurry, Lana!
She yelled, her voice tinged with desperation. Triton leapt toward the demilich, his sword striking down on it. The demilich reeled, its movements erratic and unstable.
Now!
Mesra screamed. With a determined cry, Lana plunged her dagger into the phylactery, shattering it into shards. The demilich let out a deafening wail as its skull cracked, the magic holding it together unraveling.
No! My power!
It shrieked before disintegrating into a cloud of ash. Silence fell over the chamber, the oppressive air lifting as the sapphire crown now lay unguarded, its glow soft and inviting.
We did it!
Mesra said, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. Lana carefully picked up the crown, cradling it as though it might vanish at any moment.
Let's get out of here before anything else shows up,
she said firmly. Triton nodded, still in a weakened state, sheathing his sword.
Agreed,
he said, his voice steady, but his expression heavy with an unspoken burden. With the sapphire crown in hand, the group retraced their steps, the memory of the demilich still fresh in their minds. The return to Clancy's tavern was unusually quiet. The group had expected to celebrate their victory, as they always did, with laughter, food, and tales of their latest adventures. But something about Triton's demeanor had cast a shadow over the reunion. His normally stoic face carried a weight that none of them could ignore. Inside the tavern, the warm glow of lanterns and the hum of conversation from the other patrons did little to ease the tension. Triton pushed open the door with more force than necessary, causing it to swing back and creak on its hinges. The others followed him in, exchanging uneasy glances. The group sat down, but the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Mesra glanced at Triton, her brows knitting in concern. He sat at the edge of the table, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. Lana leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes fixed on Triton.
All right, what's going on? You've been brooding ever since we left the caverns.
Triton didn't respond. He stared at the wooden table, his jaw clenched.
Come on, Triton. Whatever it is, we can help. You don't have to keep it to yourself.
Mesra said gently, leaning forward. Still, Triton said nothing. Grodd slammed his fist on the table, causing their mugs to rattle.
Speak, man! You're acting like the world's already ended.
Triton shot him a glare that silenced the dwarf, but as his companions stared at him, their concern evident, Triton's shoulders sagged. He exhaled sharply, his voice low and strained.
My mother,
he finally said, his words barely audible over the din of the tavern. The group leaned in closer. Ven knew some of the news, but kept silent.
What about her?
Mesra asked, her voice soft. Triton hesitated, the words seemingly caught in his throat. He shook his head, pushing his chair back abruptly and standing.
It doesn't matter,
he muttered. Before anyone could stop him, Triton stormed toward the tavern door, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. Chairs scraped and toppled as he shoved them out of his way.
Triton!
Mesra called after him, but he didn't stop. The patrons turned to watch as Triton pushed past them, his broad shoulders knocking into anyone who didn't move fast enough. A burly man standing near the bar growled in protest, but one look at Triton's fiery expression made him step aside. Triton reached the door and flung it open, the cold night air rushing in. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Mesra stood abruptly.
Stay here. I'll talk to him.
The dimly lit stables smelled of hay and damp wood. The faint sounds of horses shuffling in their stalls filled the air as Mesra stepped inside, her footsteps muffled on the straw-covered floor. Her gaze landed on Triton, his broad back to her as he worked to saddle a horse. His movements were sharp, almost angry, as he tightened the straps with unnecessary force. The tension in his shoulders spoke volumes, and Mesra hesitated for a moment before speaking.
Triton,
She called softly, stepping closer.
I don't want to talk about it.
He replied without turning, his voice low and edged with steel.
that's too bad. You don't get to storm off like that and leave us all wondering what's going on. We're your friends, Triton. Let us help.
He froze, his hands stilling on the saddle. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression a storm of anger and grief. His eyes, normally steady and unyielding, now burned with an intensity Mesra had rarely seen.
Help?
He snapped.
What can you possibly do to help? You can't change what's happened. None of you can.
Mesra crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering despite the sharpness of his words.
What happened? Has your mother taken ill?
Her voice gentler, but no less insistent. Triton's jaw tightened, his gaze darting away as if he couldn't bear to look at her.
It's none of your concern.
Before Mesra could press him further, a soft creak of wood announced Ven's presence as he stepped into the stable. He approached slowly, his usual playful demeanor absent, replaced by an air of quiet seriousness. He rested a gentle hand on Mesra's shoulder, pulling her attention to him.
Mez, this is something Triton has to do on his own,
Ven said, his tone calm but firm. Mesra whirled on him, her frustration boiling over.
What? What is it that you know, Ven? Tell me.
Ven hesitated, his eyes flicking to Triton, who had resumed his preparations in stony silence.
It's not my place,
he said, finally, his voice heavy with understanding. Mesra turned back to Triton, her voice rising with a mix of exasperation and concern.
What are you planning to do, Triton? Talk to me.
Triton paused, his hand resting on the reins of the horse. He exhaled sharply, the sound filled with barely restrained emotion.
I'm going to Sumeris.
Sumeris? That's a week's travel by horse. What's in Sumeris that's so important?
It's personal.
Triton replied, his voice hardening. Mesra stepped closer, her tone softening as she tried to reach him.
We're coming with you. Whatever it is, we'll face it together.
No, this is something I need to do alone.
Triton said firmly, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her take a step back.
Mesra, let it go. Triton's made up his mind. We'll see him again soon.
Ven interjected, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade.
Right, Triton?
Triton remained silent, his jaw clenched and lips drawn into a thin line. The weight of unspoken thoughts lingered in the air. After a long, tense pause, he gave a sharp nod, his eyes shadowed with something unreadable. His voice was low, edged with finality.
See that the Sapphire Crown reaches Alira, and claim the rest of the reward for yourselves.
Ven dips his head in a solemn nod, his voice low and resolute as he declares,
We will, Triton. Safe travels and Godspeed.
For a brief moment, the three of them stood in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Mesra's heart ached as she searched Triton's face, looking for some sign that he would let her in, but he turned away, his shoulders rigid with determination. Without another word, Triton mounted the horse, his movements quick and decisive. He urged the horse forward, guiding it out of the stables. The sound of hooves echoed in the still night, growing fainter until they were swallowed by the darkness. Mesra stood there for a moment, the cold night air seeping into her skin. Her heart felt heavy, torn between respecting Triton's wishes and the gnawing worry that something terrible awaited him. Ven gently touched her arm, offering silent comfort.
Let's head back,
Ven said softly. Mesra nodded reluctantly, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on her as they returned to the tavern. Inside, Grodd and Lana sat in a tense silence, their faces filled with concern. Grodd was the first to speak, his deep voice breaking the quiet.
Well, what's he doing?
He's going to Samaris,
Mesra said, her voice strained.
and he's going alone.
Ven added, his tone somber.
Why? What's going on?
Lana asked, her brows knitting together in confusion. Mesra opened her mouth to answer, but found she couldn't. The truth was, she didn't know. Triton had closed himself off, leaving her, and the rest of them, in the dark. The group fell into an uneasy silence, the camaraderie that usually bound them together replaced by a shared sense of dread. Outside, the night was calm, but within Triton's heart, a storm brewed. Triton rode into the night, the memory of his mother's face haunting him. The road to Samaris stretched long and uncertain before him, but the grief in his chest burned brighter than any fear of what lies ahead. Back at the tavern, Mesra sat quietly, her mind racing. She glanced at her companions, their concern mirroring her own.
We'll see him again soon,
She said, softly, though the words felt hollow. The night pressed on, heavy and foreboding, as if the world itself sensed the shift in their path. Somewhere deep in the Breen forest, fate stirred, and Triton's journey to Samaris would prove to be more than a test of his strength. It would challenge the very foundation of who he was,